Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most gracious. This is Ahmad Zahran speaking, and welcome to our lecture for today. After finishing everything that's related to the anatomy of the brain and the cerebellum and the brainstem, after finishing everything that's related to the cranial nerve journeys and the cranial vessel journeys, today we're going to have an important lecture as we're going to discuss the coverings that cover and protect the central nervous system. Welcome to our lecture for today as we're going to talk about the meninges. If you receive this gift, a nice box of Ferrero Rocher chocolates, and you want to eat these delicious chocolates here, there are several steps that you have to do in order to reach these chocolates. I think in the beginning you have to open this hard plastic box here and then find every chocolate in here that is covered by itself by special coverings, and then after you open these coverings you can reach your chocolate. It's very precious, and that's why it has to be covered by several layers of coverings. And this is what happens for the central nervous system. The structures of the central nervous system are covered by layers and layers of coverings that we collectively call the meninges. If you open the skull and look at what's inside it, you will find that all the structures of the brain are covered with meninges that are actually composed of 3 layers of meninges. So in order to reach the brain, you have to pass through 3 consecutive layers, and let's get to know them. The first layer you can see here is that layer that's directly related to the cerebral cortex. It's directly attached to the cerebral cortex, and its name is the pia mater. The pia mater. Okay. The second layer here, this is called the arachnoid mater. The arachnoid mater. Okay, this is the second layer in between. And finally, this tough layer in here that's directly lining the skull bone, it's called the dura mater. The dura mater. Okay, so we have 3 layers of meninges now, I know them. We have the pia mater that's directly attached to the cerebral cortex. Then we have the arachnoid mater. And then finally we have the dura mater. Actually, these 3 layers are attached to each other, but you can find some potential spaces that are present between these 3 layers. Okay, so this is the dura mater, but you know that the dura mater is directly lining the skull. But there is a potential space here between the dura and the skull that we call the extradural space or the epidural space. Okay. And here between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater, there is a potential space that we call the subdural space. Nice. Okay, I guess you know the name of the space that's between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater. Yes, it's called the subarachnoid space. I guess you've heard that name before. Yes, the subarachnoid space. It's that space that's present between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater. Okay. And finally, below the pia mater, there is a potential space that's directly adherent to the brain, which is called the subpial space. So now I know that there are several layers that are covering the brain, even under the skull, okay? And these layers are the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. And we know that there are potential spaces between these layers that are the epidural space between the dura and the skull, the subdural space between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater, the subarachnoid space between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater, and finally the subpial space that is between the pia mater and the cerebral cortex. How amazing is that? And now let's get to know every layer in detail and know everything about these layers, and how about start with the pia mater. This layer, the first layer of the meninges that's directly attached to the cerebral cortex. This pia mater has a special thing about it, is that it covers all and every single part of the cerebral cortex and the CNS. It covers every part of the cortex, whether in the gyri or even in the sulci. It passes deep into the sulci to cover every single part of the cortex. And that is what makes the pia mater more special, that it covers every part of the cerebral cortex, whether in the gyri or even deep there in the sulci. Okay, so this is what is related to the pia mater, and the most important thing you have to know about the pia mater is that it covers every part of the cerebral cortex, whether in the gyri up there or even deep down there within the sulci. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay. What about the arachnoid mater? The arachnoid mater is actually also covering all of the brain surface, but it does not cover the brain within the sulci, as you can see here. Okay. So it's covering the whole brain, yes, but not deep into the sulci like the pia mater. But I guess I can see here that the subarachnoid space is present within the sulci. Yes, that's right. So the arachnoid mater itself covers the whole brain but does not go deep into the sulci, but the subarachnoid space goes into the sulci and fills the sulci, as you can see here. This subarachnoid space has special things that's related to it. There are many trabeculations inside this subarachnoid space that keeps the arachnoid space away from the pia mater. These trabeculations can also support blood vessels. Okay, so the second information you know about the subarachnoid space is that it contains blood vessels. The blood vessels that are running on the surface of the brain are actually running within the subarachnoid space that is supported by trabeculations that are present within this space. And the most important information you have to know about this space, the subarachnoid space, is that it's filled with CSF. Oh my God, yes, CSF. I remember the CSF was there in the ventricles. Yes, but you have to remember the CSF circulation. You know, the CSF was produced inside the ventricles by the choroid plexus, and then it passes from the lateral ventricle to the third ventricle through foramen of Monro, and then from the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle through the aqueduct of Sylvius before it leaves the ventricular system through the foramina of Luschka and Magendie to reach the subarachnoid space. And today I'm telling you the same information, but from the other side. I'm telling you that today I'm studying the subarachnoid space, this potential space here that's present between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater, and this space contains trabeculations and contains the blood vessels that are running on the surface of the brain, and it's filled with CSF that is coming originally from the ventricles and has passed through the subarachnoid space through what? Through the foramina of Luschka and Magendie to reach the subarachnoid space around the brain and the spinal cord. And if you remember the circulation, the CSF circulation, we know that the whole circulation ends when this CSF then pours into or drains into the sinuses or the dural sinuses through arachnoid granulations. Here they are, the arachnoid granulations. They are projections from the subarachnoid space into the dural sinuses so that they can drain or pour the CSF outside of the brain and outside of the circulation till it reaches the blood or the venous circulation and gets outside of the skull. How amazing is that? How amazing is that? So now I know the pia mater, which is directly attached to the brain cortex and even follows the sulci and the gyri and everywhere, okay? And then we know the arachnoid mater here, that it covers the whole brain but does not reach the sulci and gyri, but the subarachnoid space actually fills these sulci and covers every part of the brain just over the pia mater. And I know that this subarachnoid space contains trabeculations supporting supporting this space and supporting even blood vessels that are running on the surface of the brain within the subarachnoid space. And I know that this subarachnoid space is filled with CSF, and that this subarachnoid space gives projections into the dural sinuses that are called the arachnoid granulations that drain or pour the CSF outside of the subarachnoid space into the dural sinuses. As I said, the subarachnoid space covers everything around the brain and the brainstem and even the spinal cord. But there are some areas in which this subarachnoid space becomes a bit wider. Okay, and when the subarachnoid space becomes wider, it's called a cistern. I think I've heard that before, yes. When you hear the word cistern, it means a wide subarachnoid space. And there are many cisterns that we've mentioned before. We have the cisterna magna, which is the cerebellomedullary cistern. We have the prepontine cistern, the interpeduncular cistern, the quadrigeminal cistern, and other cisterns. What I want to mention here is that a cistern is a wide subarachnoid space, and of course, it's filled with CSF as well. How amazing is that? How amazing is that? And this is what you have to know about the subarachnoid space, the space that's present between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater. It contains trabeculations supporting its structure, and the blood vessels that run on the surface of the brain actually run within the subarachnoid space. I know that it's filled with CSF coming from the ventricular system through foramina of Luschka and Magendie. I know that there are arachnoid granulations projecting from the subarachnoid space into the dural sinuses to drain or pour the CSF outside of the circulation. And I know that there are certain areas in which the subarachnoid spaces are actually wider in size, and these are called the subarachnoid cisterns. How amazing is that? Now I know everything about the pia mater and the arachnoid mater and even the subarachnoid space. Now let's move to the big boss here, the dura mater, the tough covering that covers everything within the cranial cavity and even the spinal cord, the dura mater. The dura mater is a tough layer, as I said. It covers everything inside and protects everything inside. This dura mater is directly related to the skull from outside, and it's related from inside to the arachnoid mater, separated from it by the subdural space. Okay, so the dura actually lines the skull. It's directly related to the skull. So if you open the skull, the first layer you're going to see is the dura mater. Okay. Actually, the dura mater is composed of two layers. Two layers. An outer layer that we call the periosteal layer of the dura that is directly related to the skull. This is called the periosteal layer of the dura. And we have an inner layer or a visceral layer or a meningeal layer of the dura that is directly related to the subdural space and the arachnoid mater then afterwards. Okay, so now I know about the dura mater, that it's this tough layer that covers everything and that it lines the skull. And I know that it is composed of two layers, an outer periosteal layer that directly lines the skull, and an inner meningeal layer that's related to the inner structure starting from the arachnoid inwards. Okay, thank you very much. Okay. I want to add another information that I guess you know very well from the previous lecture, that within this dura, there are some cavities that are formed between the outer and the inner layer of the duras, and these cavities are actually filled with venous blood. And sometimes we call these cavities as the dural venous sinuses. Exactly, okay, so this means that the superior sagittal sinus is actually a cavity within the dura between the outer and the inner layer. Yes, the cavernous sinus, the superior petrosal sinus, the inferior petrosal sinus, all these sinuses are actually, they are cavities that are present between the layers of the dura, the outer periosteal layer and the inner meningeal layer, and these cavities are filled with venous blood, and they are not called veins, they are called the dural venous sinuses. How amazing is that? I know too much information now about the dura mater, that it's this tough covering of the brain and the spinal cord, and it lines the skull, and I know it's composed of two layers. And an outer periosteal layer that's lining the skull, and an inner meningeal layer that's related to the inner structures. And I know that within this dura, there are some areas in which there are cavities that are filled with venous blood that are called the dural venous sinuses. Okay, how amazing is that? Is that it? Well, actually, there is one final information you have to know about the dura mater. That it does not just cover the brain and protect the brain and the inner structures, but it also helps in performing some compartmentation within the cranial cavity. It divides the cranial cavity into compartments. This dura forms dural folds, and these dural folds will help to separate different compartments of the brain. And let's get to know that. You know very well that we have two cerebral hemispheres, right? Yes, two cerebral hemispheres, and that these cerebral hemispheres, between them there is this medial longitudinal fissure. Yes, you know that? Yes, this longitudinal fissure in here. Well, actually, the dura mater will form a fold that goes deep into the medial longitudinal fissure, separating the two cerebral hemispheres from each other. This fold here is called the falx cerebri. The falx cerebri. Okay. Wait a minute. I guess that the superior sagittal sinus was present in the attached border of this falx cerebri? Yes, that's right. And the inferior sagittal sinus was present in the free border of this falx cerebri. How amazing is that? Okay, so this dural fold here that's called the falx cerebri, it's a dural, it's formed of dura, it's a dural fold that forms compartmentation of the brain. It separates the two cerebral hemispheres from each other by passing through the medial longitudinal fissure. How amazing is that? And this dural fold here is called the falx cerebri. There's actually another dural fold that separates the two cerebellar hemispheres. It's a small fold here, down here, separating the two cerebellar hemispheres from each other. It's called the falx cerebelli. The falx cerebelli. Okay, how nice. Okay. There is an important dural fold here that separates the brain from the cerebellum. It separates the brain from the cerebellum. I think you know its name. I've mentioned that before. It's called the tentorium cerebelli. Okay, so the tentorium cerebelli was actually a dural fold. Yes, it's a dural fold that separates the brain from the cerebellum. Sometimes we call the brain or the structures that are above the tentorium cerebelli, we call them the supratentorial compartment. And what lies below the tentorium cerebelli is called the infratentorial compartment. How amazing is that? Well, actually, you know that within this tentorium cerebelli there are other sinuses, dural venous sinuses. Yes, I know the straight sinus that runs in the middle of the tentorium cerebelli here, runs straight backwards in the middle of the tentorium cerebelli, that was formed by the union of the inferior sagittal sinus with the great cerebral vein of Galen. Yes, exactly. And then it runs backwards within the tentorium cerebelli, and then forming the torcular ophirophilus, the confluence of sinuses back here, before giving the right and left transverse sinuses which run at the attached border of the tentorium cerebelli. Well, actually, you have to know that the falx cerebri here that separates the two cerebral hemispheres from each other, and even the falx cerebelli down here that separates the two cerebellar hemispheres from each other, are actually attached to the tentorium cerebelli. Okay, so you can see that the falx cerebri here is attached to the upper surface of the tentorium cerebelli, and that the falx cerebelli is attached to the lower surface of the tentorium cerebelli. How amazing is that? This is what you have to know about the dura. This is what you have to know about the meninges. I know now that we have 3 layers of meninges. We know the pia mater that's directly attached to the brain surface and even runs within the sulci and gyri, covering every part of the brain. I know that there is a subpial space that's just below the pia mater, and it's a very potential space. Then we know the arachnoid mater that covers every part of the brain but does not go within the sulci, but actually there is a subarachnoid space between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater that goes deep into the sulci. This arachnoid mater is filled with trabeculations, and there are blood vessels that run on the surface of the brain. They run within the subarachnoid space. I know that it's filled with CSF. I know that gives projections to the dural venous sinuses called arachnoid granulations that pour or drain the CSF outside of the cranial, outside of the subarachnoid space. And I know that there are certain areas in which the subarachnoid space becomes wider, and they are called the arachnoid cisterns. Okay. And then I know the dura mater, the tough covering of the brain here, the dura mater, that's directly lining the skull, and it's composed of two layers, an outer periosteal layer and an inner meningeal layer, and that there are certain areas in which this dura has cavities filled with venous blood that we call the dural venous sinuses. Exactly. And we know that this dura forms dural folds, and these dural folds help in compartmentation of the cranial cavity. We know the falx cerebri that separates the two cerebral hemispheres. And we know that the superior sagittal sinus is present in the attached border of the falx cerebri, and that the inferior sagittal sinus is present in the free border of the falx cerebri. We know also the falx cerebelli that separates the two cerebellar hemispheres from each other, and we know the tentorium cerebelli, that separates the brain from the cerebellum. We know that the falx cerebri is attached from above to the tentorium cerebelli, and the falx cerebelli is attached from below. And we know that there are sinuses that run within the tentorium cerebelli that are the straight sinus, the confluence of sinuses, and the transverse sinus. How amazing is that? This was a quick lecture about the coverings or the meninges of the brain. I guess now we know everything about what's inside the cranial cavity. Brain and coverings, blood vessels and nerves, everything. I guess you know everything about that. Now I guess you're ready to start knowing more and more about the anatomy of the skull. And this is going to be our new series starting from next lecture, as we're going to start discussing the anatomy of the skull. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and become a member of Neuroanatomy in English playlist. See you next lecture. This is Ahmed Zahran.